The first ring went unanswered. The second echoed through an empty penthouse high above the city, cutting through the kind of silence that only money could buy. On the third ring, Damian Ward almost didn't answer. He'd silenced most of the world years ago. Reporters, investors, old friends. But something about the trembling, childish voice that came through when he finally pressed accept made him freeze. "Please," the little girl whispered. "My mommy fell down and she won't wake up." Damian blinked. He'd been expecting another board call, not desperation. "You've reached the wrong number," he said automatically, already pulling the phone from his ear. But then came a sob, small, helpless, and so real it tore straight through the armor of his detachment. "I tried the number on the fridge, but I must have got it wrong," the girl said between hiccups. "You sound nice, though. Please, please come help. I'm scared." He didn't think. He just asked, "Where are you?" 15 minutes later, the black SUV skidded to a halt outside a crumbling apartment complex on the city's south side. Damian barely recognized the feeling pulsing through him. Adrenaline, maybe, or guilt. As he shoved the door open and rushed toward the sound of faint crying coming from the second floor. The hallway smelled of old paint and rain. A small figure appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching a stuffed rabbit in one hand and a phone in the other. She couldn't have been more than 7. "Are you the man from the phone?" she asked. He nodded. "Where's your mother?" Without another word, she turned and ran down the narrow hall, stopping at a door with peeling white paint. Inside, a woman lay motionless on the kitchen floor, her face pale, lips faintly blue, a shattered coffee cup beside her hand. Damian knelt instantly, checking for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He looked up at the girl. "Call 911. "I already tried," she said, panic flashing in her eyes. "It just beeped. I don't know if they're coming." "Then we're not waiting," he said. He lifted the woman carefully into his arms. She was light, too light, and he could feel the fragile thrum of her heartbeat against his chest as he carried her out into the rain. The girl followed close behind, her little shoes splashing through puddles as she whispered to herself, "Don't die, Mommy. Don't die." At St. Marin Hospital, Damian barked orders with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. The staff didn't recognize him at first. Just another stranger bringing in an emergency case. But when his name hit the intake form, a quiet murmur passed through the nurse's station. Within minutes, the woman, Elena Ruiz, according to her driver's license, was wheeled into intensive care. Damian stood in the hallway, soaked through, the girl's small hand clutching his sleeve. "Will she be okay?" the girl asked, voice quivering. He looked down at her, at the raw fear in her eyes. "She will," he said, though he had no idea if it was true. The nurse approached. "She's stable," she said. "Dehydration, exhaustion, low blood sugar. We'll keep her overnight." Damian nodded, the relief hitting him harder than expected. He'd faced billion-dollar losses and hostile takeovers without blinking. Yet one fainted woman and a little girl had undone him. The nurse smiled at the girl. "You're very brave, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Sophie," she said softly. "Sophie Ruiz." The nurse's smile deepened. "You did the right thing calling for help." Sophie looked up at Damian and whispered, "I called the wrong number." He crouched down beside her. Maybe it wasn't the wrong one after all. Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in a waiting room chair, Damian stood by the glass wall of the ICU, watching the machines hum around Elena's still form. He didn't know why he was still there. He'd done his part. She was alive. The doctors were handling it. He could have walked away at any time, but he didn't. Something about the scene, the quiet beeping monitors, the fluorescent light spilling across her face, clawed at a part of him he'd buried years ago. When the attending doctor came by, Damian straightened. "Will she make a full recovery?" "With rest and proper care, yes," the doctor said. "But she's been undernourished and overworked. This wasn't her first collapse." "She has a daughter," Damian said. "She shouldn't be living like this." The doctor gave him a weary look. "Mr. Ward, most of the city lives like this." Damian didn't answer. As dawn broke, Sophie stirred awake. Damian sat beside her with a cup of cocoa from the vending machine. When she saw him, she smiled sleepily. "You stayed?" He nodded. "Your mom's going to be okay." She yawned, curling into the chair. Thank you for coming when I called. He hesitated, then said quietly, You know, sometimes mistakes happen for a reason. Sophie tilted her head. Do you believe that? He looked at her, this tiny stranger who had reached out into the void and somehow grabbed him by the soul. I do now. Outside, the first light of morning hit the hospital windows, turning the rain into gold. Damien Ward, a man who'd built empires and lost himself along the way, didn't yet know it. But the wrong number that had woken him in the night was about to rewrite everything he thought he understood about mercy, redemption, and love. The rhythmic hum of hospital machines filled the air, steady as a heartbeat. Elena Ruiz stirred, the sterile scent of antiseptic biting her nose as consciousness slowly returned. Her head felt heavy, her body weightless, and for a moment, she didn't remember where she was, only that she'd been standing in her kitchen, then darkness. When her eyes finally opened, she was met by a soft glow from the fluorescent lights above and a curtain drawn halfway across her bed. A nurse adjusted an IV drip nearby and smiled gently. You're awake, the nurse said. You've been out since last night. How do you feel? Like I fell off a building, Elena croaked. Her throat was dry, her lips cracked. Where's my daughter? In the waiting area, the nurse reassured her. She's been here all night with the gentleman who brought you in. The what? Elena frowned, the memory blurring back into fragments. The rush of air, the sound of footsteps, someone's voice calling her name that she didn't recognize. Who? The nurse smiled faintly. A Mr. Ward. He's still here, actually. Would you like me to call him in? Elena hesitated. A stranger had brought her to the hospital? Yes, she said finally, uncertain. When Damien entered the room, she didn't recognize him at first. Tall, sharply dressed, despite the exhaustion in his eyes, with an air of control that didn't belong in places like this. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed, not thanked. You're the man who brought me here? She asked, her voice fragile but edged with suspicion. He nodded. Your daughter called me. By accident, apparently. Elena blinked. You mean she called the wrong number? That's right, he said. She thought she was calling a relative. My phone rang instead. She looked down at her hands, ashamed. I'm so sorry. She must have been terrified. She was, Damien said quietly, but she did everything right. You should be proud of her. Elena's eyes softened at that, though the embarrassment lingered. And you just came? Just like that? He shrugged slightly. It seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him for a long moment, her brow knitting. You look familiar. I get that a lot. You're not, she squinted. You're not that Damien Ward, are you? He hesitated, then gave a faint non-committal smile. Depends which one you mean. Elena's eyes widened. The billionaire? Lucent Core? He sighed. Used to be. I left the board 2 years ago. She stared at him, incredulous. So my daughter accidentally calls a billionaire, and you just show up? I'm not very good at ignoring things that sound like emergencies, he said simply. Besides, she was persuasive. A small laugh escaped her, despite herself. That sounds like Sophie. An hour later, Sophie came bursting through the curtain with a juice box in one hand and her stuffed rabbit in the other. When she saw her mother awake, she let out a squeal and ran straight to her bedside. Mommy, you're okay. Elena gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly. I'm okay, baby. I'm okay. Sophie grinned up at her. Mr. Damien stayed with me all night. He bought me chocolate milk and told me stories about cars. Damien coughed, rubbing the back of his neck. They were educational stories. Elena smiled faintly. You really didn't have to do all that. I didn't mind, he said. She's good company. For the first time, Elena saw the softness behind his composed demeanor. The way he looked at Sophie with quiet fondness, like he hadn't smiled in years and was only now remembering how. Later that morning, as doctors finished their evaluations, Damien lingered by the door. He hadn't meant to stay this long. He'd made the call, carried the woman in, paid the bills up front. And yet, leaving felt wrong. When the doctor confirmed that Elena could be discharged later that day, Damien approached the counter and handed over his card. Put the charges on this, he said. The nurse looked startled. Sir, that's quite a sum. Are you sure? Completely. From behind him, Elena's voice cut in. Excuse me? Damien turned, caught. It's taken care of. She frowned. No, I can't accept that. I'll pay it myself. You can't, he said softly. You were barely standing yesterday. Let this one go. Elena stiffened. I don't take charity. Neither do I, Damien said. This isn't charity. It's a thank you. For what? She asked, incredulous. He looked at Sophie, who was humming quietly to her stuffed rabbit. For reminding me that people still do the right thing just because it's right. Her expression faltered, the fight in her eyes dimming. I don't know what to say. Then don't, he replied gently. Just get better. By the time Elena was ready to leave, Damien had already gone. A nurse mentioned that he'd left a note. She found it tucked beneath the blanket on her bed. Neat handwriting on crisp stationery. You don't owe me anything. Just promise you'll take care of yourself and that little girl. D.W. Elena held the note for a long time, her chest tight. That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, she stood by the window of their small apartment, staring out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, a man she didn't know had changed her life. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she had the strange, uneasy feeling that their paths weren't finished crossing. 3 days had passed since Elena's discharge, but the weight of everything that had happened lingered like fog in her tiny apartment. The doctor had warned her to rest, yet rest didn't come easily. Not when there were bills stacked on the counter, an overdue notice taped to the door, and a 7-year-old whose innocence kept colliding with the harshness of their reality. Sophie, at least, seemed untouched by worry. She hummed softly at the kitchen table, coloring with crayons while her mother reheated yesterday's soup. The smell of onions and cheap broth filled the air. Mommy, Sophie said, not looking up, do you think Mr. Damien will come visit us? Elena froze, ladle in hand. Why would he do that, sweetheart? He's a busy man. He said he would check on you, Sophie replied matter-of-factly, and people who say that should mean it. Elena smiled faintly. Maybe, but sometimes grown-ups say things just to be kind. Sophie frowned. That's lying. The blunt honesty made Elena laugh, a soft, weary sound. You're right. I suppose it is. That evening, as thunder rolled over the city and rain streaked the window panes, a sharp knock startled both of them. Sophie jumped from her chair. That's him! Before Elena could stop her, the little girl darted to the door and swung it open. Damien Ward stood there, rain dripping from his coat, holding a brown paper bag in one hand. Evening, he said, offering a polite smile. I hope I'm not intruding. Elena blinked, unsure whether to laugh or scold. You actually came. You didn't look well enough to cook last time, he said simply, stepping inside as Sophie ushered him in like an old friend. I brought dinner. The smell of roasted chicken and fresh bread instantly filled the room, chasing away the thin metallic scent of poverty that clung to the walls. Sophie clapped her hands. See, Mommy, he meant it. Damien chuckled and handed her the bread. I did. You're a good judge of character. Elena tried to hide her embarrassment as she cleared space on the cluttered table. You really didn't have to. I know, he said, setting down the food. That's why I did. Over dinner, conversation came easily. Sophie told stories about her school, her rabbit, and how she wanted to become a doctor like Mommy, but also an astronaut. Damien listened, genuinely interested, occasionally asking questions that made her giggle. Elena watched quietly at first, her guard softening with each passing minute. She hadn't seen Sophie so happy in weeks. When Sophie ran off to wash her hands after dessert, Damien leaned back in his chair. You're raising an extraordinary kid. She's everything, Elena said softly. He nodded. I can see that. A pause stretched between them. Damien glanced around the apartment, the flickering light bulb, the peeling wallpaper, the stack of unpaid utility bills tucked beneath a vase. His jaw tightened. You used to work at St. Marin Hospital, he said. You were a nurse. Her expression hardened slightly. Used to, yes. Why did you leave? Elena hesitated. She didn't owe him an explanation, But something about his tone wasn't pity. It was curiosity, concern. "I didn't leave," she said finally. "I was fired." Damien's eyes narrowed. "For what?" "For telling the truth," she said quietly. "A child died because of a faulty monitor. I filed a report. The company that supplied the equipment threatened to pull funding from the hospital, and I was made the scapegoat. Breach of protocol, they called it." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. Damien stared at her, the pieces slotting into place in his mind. "What company?" "Lucent Core Medical Technologies." The name hit him like a hammer. Lucent Core, his company, the one he'd founded years ago, before stepping down after a scandal he thought had been buried. He tried to mask his reaction, but Elena saw the flicker in his eyes. "You know them?" she asked. "Yes," he said carefully. "I know them." Outside, thunder cracked and the lights flickered. Damien stood and walked to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked street. "You were right to report it," he said finally. "They should have listened." Elena gave a bitter laugh. "No one listens when there's money involved." He turned back to her, his gaze steady. "Maybe they will now." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Damien said slowly, "that sometimes it takes the right mistake to find the truth." Sophie returned, hopping into her chair. "What are you talking about?" "Adult stuff," Damien said, smiling faintly. "Boring things." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "Then you should both stop talking about it." Elena laughed, but Damien's mind was elsewhere. He excused himself soon after, promising to check in again. At the door, Elena stopped him. "Why are you really doing this?" He met her eyes. "Because I think I was part of something that hurt people like you, and I don't intend to let that stand." Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, vanishing into the rain with his black SUV's taillights glowing like embers in the dark. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Elena sat at the kitchen table, Damien's words looping in her mind. Lucent Core, truth, mistake. She pulled out the old folder she'd kept hidden under a floorboard. Copies of reports, email printouts, one document she'd never shown anyone. At the bottom was a signature. A. Kalin, Chief Financial Officer, Lucent Core. For the first time since losing her job, she felt the spark of something dangerous but necessary, hope mixed with defiance. Outside, the city lights flickered through the rain. Somewhere across town, Damien Ward opened his laptop, staring at the Lucent Core logo on the screen, and whispered, "What did you do, Andrew?" The next morning, Damien sat in his office surrounded by silence, save for the soft hum of his computer. The city skyline stretched before him through floor-to-ceiling glass, but he barely noticed. On the screen was a list of internal Lucent Core memos, each stamped with dates that shouldn't have existed. 3 years ago, he'd signed off on a product recall, something about defective cardiac monitors, but the recall had never happened. The paperwork was forged, his signature duplicated. Someone had overridden his decision, buried the evidence, and allowed the devices to remain in circulation. One of those devices had killed a child. Elena Ruiz had told the truth, and she'd paid for it with her career. Damien leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Andrew Kalin, he muttered. The name was everywhere. Approval forms, accounting transfers, safety sign-offs. The man had been his CFO, his second in command, the one who'd convinced him to step away after a quiet scandal. Damien had thought he was doing the right thing by trusting him. Now he saw it for what it was, a betrayal wrapped in business suits and polished smiles. He picked up the phone and called his old head of security. "Jonas, I need you to dig into Kalin's recent activity. Pull financials, communications, board votes, everything. Quietly." Jonas didn't hesitate. "You think he's dirty?" "I think he's worse," Damien said. "And if I'm right, he's been profiting off of people's deaths." There was a pause. "Understood. I'll call you back in an hour." Across town, Elena was sitting at her small kitchen table, staring at the old envelope she'd pulled from under the floorboard. The name Connor was written across the front in her careful, looping script. The child whose heart monitor had failed. Inside were documents she'd tried to forget. A patient log, a maintenance report, An anonymous email warning her to stop digging if you want to keep your job. She could still remember the sound of his mother's voice that night. The alarms hadn't gone off. The line had stayed flat, and by the time they realized it was too late. Elena's hands trembled as she pulled out the last page. A copy of the safety certificate, stamped with an approval code, and a signature she now knew was fake. When her phone buzzed, she jumped. A text from Damien. "Can we meet? Urgent, somewhere private." She hesitated only a moment before replying. "There's a cafe near St. Marine, back entrance. Noon." The cafe smelled of coffee beans and old books. Rain misted against the windows as Elena slid into a booth, clutching her coat. Damien arrived moments later, wearing the same tailored calm that seemed to hide everything he was feeling. He placed a folder on the table. "I found them," he said. "Emails, forged documents, payments routed through shell accounts. Andrew Kalin's behind it all." Elena's stomach turned. "And you're telling me this why?" "Because you deserve to know you were right," he said. "And because I need your help to prove it." She blinked. "My help? You were inside the system when it happened. You have first-hand records. I can expose the fraud, but your testimony, your documentation, will make it undeniable." She shook her head immediately. "No, I can't. They'll come after me again. I barely survived the first time." Damien leaned forward, his tone firm but gentle. "They already ruined your life once. Don't let them keep owning it." Her jaw tightened. "Easy for you to say. You still have everything." He hesitated, then said quietly, "You think I do? I built that company to save lives, and instead, it's killed them. That's not success, Elena. That's rot." His voice cracked slightly at the end, surprising them both. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "If I help you," she said, "this doesn't end quietly, does it?" "No," he admitted. "It won't." She exhaled slowly. "Then we do it my way. No lawyers, no boardrooms. We start with what they tried to bury." Damien nodded. "Agreed." By evening, they were back in her apartment. Sophie was at a neighbor's house, leaving the place eerily still. Elena spread the contents of the envelope across the kitchen table, scanned copies of maintenance logs, time-stamped incident reports, and one photo that made Damien's blood run cold, a smiling child with dark curls clutching a balloon. "Connor," Elena said softly. "He was 6. Damien swallowed hard. "He could have been saved." She nodded. "If the monitor alarm had gone off, yes." He ran a hand over the documents, the corporate logos staring back at him like ghosts. Lucent Core's internal systems show this model as discontinued. "They falsified the decommission date," she said, pulling out another sheet. "Look, this was sent 2 months after his death." He scanned the paper, jaw tightening. "Jonas was right," he muttered. "Kalin's been running a shadow budget for years." Elena frowned. "Shadow budget?" "Money siphoned through research subsidiaries. Looks legitimate until you follow the trail. He's been using recall funds to finance side contracts and erasing people like you who noticed." She went pale. "So you're saying—" "I'm saying your firing wasn't about silencing a nurse," Damien interrupted. "It was about protecting a $1 million scam." The words hung in the air, sharp as glass. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Finally, Elena said quietly, "Then we ended." Damien looked up. "Together?" She nodded, sliding the last document toward him. "You wanted proof. Now you have it." He met her eyes, something steely sparking behind his own. "Then tomorrow we start digging deeper. And when we're done, no one at Lucent Core will ever be able to hide again." Outside, lightning split the night sky. And for the first time in years, Damien Ward felt something other than guilt. He felt purpose. By morning, Damien's penthouse no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a command center. His desk was covered in files, digital reports, and printed spreadsheets from Jonas's overnight dig. The rain hadn't stopped. It streaked down the glass walls like time bleeding away. Jonas's voice buzzed through the speakerphone. "You were right. The money trail's a mess, but it's deliberate. Kalin's been rerouting safety recall budgets through dummy accounts registered under research subsidiaries. Millions. Where's it going? Damien asked, staring at a transaction list highlighted in red. Private contractors, offshore firms, and a consulting agency in Zurich that doesn't exist. It's all layered. He's been doing this for at least 3 years. Damien pinched the bridge of his nose. He used my name, my company, to kill people and make money doing it. Jonas hesitated. You want me to leak it? No, Damien said immediately. Not yet. We do this cleanly, legally. I want the board to choke on the truth. And Elena? Jonas asked. Damien glanced toward the kitchen counter where her folder sat open, the picture of Connor half covered by papers. She's the key witness. If this goes public, they'll come for her. There was a long pause. Then Jonas said, I'll keep her name buried until you say otherwise. But Damien, if you take this to the board, Kalen won't just defend himself. He'll burn you too. I know, Damien said quietly, but it's time someone got burned for the right reason. Elena spent the morning watching Sophie build a fort out of couch cushions. The sound of her daughter's laughter filled the tiny apartment, but Elena's stomach was knotted. Every instinct told her that helping Damien meant opening a door she'd spent years trying to keep shut. When the knock came, she knew who it was before she opened it. Damien stood there holding a file in one hand and 2 coffees in the other. Truce, he said, lifting the cup slightly. She managed a tired smile. You didn't need to bribe me. I wasn't sure you'd let me in otherwise. He was right, but she did. They sat at the small table, the morning sunlight slicing through the blinds. Damien spread the file open between them, a summary of everything Jonas had uncovered. Elena read in silence, her eyes widening with every page. My God, she whispered. They were moving this much money? And using it to cover recalls they never did, Damien said. They cut corners, ignored safety reports, and used forged signatures, including yours, to keep it quiet. Elena's hands trembled as she touched the papers. So every patient who died, every child, it wasn't just negligence, it was greed. He nodded grimly. And we can prove it now. She looked at him, eyes searching. Why are you really doing this, Damien? You don't have to. You could walk away. You already did once. His voice softened. Because I built the monster, Elena, and I let it live because it was profitable. I can't undo the past, but I can destroy what's left of it. For the first time, she saw the cracks behind his composure, the guilt, the exhaustion, the desperate need to make something right. After a long silence, she said, Then we finish it. By evening, they were sitting in Damien's car outside the Lucent Corps headquarters, a glass fortress rising out of the mist. This feels impossible, Elena murmured. You walk in there with this evidence, and they'll bury it. They'll bury you. I'm counting on that, he said. That's how we'll smoke them out. He turned toward her. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling an emergency board session. When Kalen tries to cover himself, he'll reveal the second layer of falsified documents. I need you to bring your originals, the ones they never thought you kept. Elena hesitated. You're using me as bait. I'm trusting you as a partner. That made her pause. You're sure this is the only way? It's the right way, he said simply. She exhaled slowly, nodding. Then we do it. That night, Damien couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, watching lightning crawl across the horizon. His reflection stared back. Older, harder, a man who'd once thought saving the world meant controlling it. Now he realized saving it meant losing control entirely. His phone buzzed. A message from Jonas. Kalen's moving assets tonight. Offshore. He knows something's coming. Damien's heart clenched. He's running, he muttered. You want me to stop him? Jonas texted. No. Let him run. Tomorrow we end it. Elena lay awake too, her mind tangled in memories. The sterile glow of hospital lights, the echo of that flatline beep, the silence afterward. For years she'd blamed herself, for not catching it sooner, for trusting the system. Now she knew where the fault truly lay. She rose quietly and walked to Sophie's room. Her daughter was fast asleep, one arm wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. Elena brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and whispered, This is for you. She turned off the light, her resolve hardening. Morning came heavy and gray. Damien's black SUV pulled up to the curb outside Elena's apartment. She stepped out with the envelope of documents clutched tightly in her hands. "You ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," she said. As they drove toward Lucencourt, neither spoke. The city blurred past, faceless, uncaring. But in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Trust. Not the easy kind, but the kind forged under pressure. At the intersection before the headquarters, Damien glanced at her. "Once we walk in there, there's no turning back." Elena met his gaze. "I don't want to turn back." He nodded, shifting the car into gear. They drove forward, toward the heart of the empire, toward the reckoning waiting inside. The boardroom at Lucencourt felt more like a courtroom. The walls of glass, once symbols of transparency, now reflected nothing but tension. Damien stood at the head of the long table, his laptop open, while the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Andrew Kalin sat across from him, calm, polished, and smug, as if the entire meeting were a mere inconvenience. "Mr. Ward," Kalin said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "it's unusual for you to call an emergency board session after your retirement. I trust this is important?" "Oh, it's important," Damien replied evenly. "In fact, it's long overdue." He turned his laptop to face the room and tapped a key. The screen on the wall lit up with transaction records, line after line of payments to shell companies and fabricated vendors. "These are Lucencourt's recall fund allocations from the past 3 years, Damien said. "Except they never reached the recall division. They were redirected into off-book accounts. All signed off by your office, Mr. Kalin." Kalin's smirk didn't falter. "You're mistaken. Those were authorized research partnerships." Damien stepped closer. "Then you won't mind explaining why one of those partners shares a bank account with your personal investment firm?" The air in the room shifted. Whispers rippled across the table. Kalin leaned back, his tone still smooth. "You're throwing around dangerous accusations, Damien. You don't even work here anymore." "That's exactly why I can speak freely," Damien said, "because I don't owe this company a damn thing anymore, except the truth." Outside the room, Elena waited with her folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her palms were slick with sweat. She could hear muffled voices through the door, each rise in tone sending her pulse racing. Jonas stood beside her, arms crossed. "He's walking a fine line in there," he muttered. "Kalin's got half the board in his pocket." "Then we'll give the other half something they can't ignore," Elena said quietly. Jonas looked at her with something like admiration. "You sure you're ready for this?" She swallowed hard. "I've been ready for 3 years." He nodded once, then opened the door. Damien looked up as Elena entered. For a moment, the noise in the room died completely. The sight of her, calm, steady, unflinching, seemed to pull the oxygen out of the air. "Who is this?" Kalin asked, feigning confusion. "This," Damien said, "is the nurse you destroyed." A murmur swept through the board members. Kalin's eyes narrowed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Of course you do," Elena said, her voice sharp but controlled. "You forged my signature on the safety reports. You used my name to certify devices that killed patients, including a 6-year-old boy named Connor." Kalin's mask cracked, just slightly. "You can't prove any of that." Elena dropped the folder on the table. "Actually, I can." She opened it and began laying out the documents. Maintenance logs, internal emails, payment slips, the falsified recall notice with the fake date. Each paper landed like a blow. "This," she said, pointing to one page, "is my employment record. You claimed I violated protocol, but here's the report I filed. Time-stamped, reviewed, and deleted from the system 48 hours later by someone in your department." Kalin shifted in his seat. "This is absurd. These documents could be fabricated." "They aren't," Damien said, sliding another file forward. "Jonas verified the digital trail last night. Every deletion, every forged signature, it all traces back to your credentials." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a silver-haired woman named Dr. Mercer, leaned forward. "Andrew, is this true?" Kalin's jaw clenched. "No, of course not. This is a witch hunt. Ward's trying to take his company back through slander." "Then explain this," Damien said, clicking his laptop again. The screen displayed a series of bank transfers totaling $12.8 million. The recipient's name appeared in bold, Kalen Strategic Holdings. For the first time, Kalen's composure cracked completely. You hacked my accounts, he snapped. I didn't have to, Damien said coldly. You used company servers. You buried the bodies in plain sight. The room fell into chaos. Voices shouting, phones buzzing, the sharp scrape of chairs against the floor. Kalen rose, slamming his hands on the table. You think you can come in here and ruin me? I built this empire with you. No, Damien said, stepping closer. You poisoned it. Security entered at Jonas's signal. Kalen tried to protest, but Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the noise. Mr. Kalen, you're suspended pending investigation. His face twisted with fury. You'll regret this, he hissed, glaring at Damien. All of you. Maybe, Damien said, but at least we'll be able to live with ourselves. Kalen was escorted out, his threats echoing down the corridor until the doors shut behind him. When the room finally emptied, Damien slumped into a chair, the adrenaline drained from his body, leaving behind only exhaustion. Elena stood quietly beside him, her expression unreadable. It's over, Jonas said from the doorway. Damien shook his head. No, not yet. He'll fight this, and the company will try to save face before saving lives. Elena placed a hand on his arm. Then we keep fighting. He looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. You know, when Sophie called me by accident, I thought it was just a fluke. Elena smiled faintly. Maybe it wasn't. Jonas cleared his throat. Sorry to interrupt your Hallmark moment, but Kalen's lawyers will be calling before sunset. We should get ahead of this. Damien rose, straightening his jacket. Then we give them something worth talking about. As they stepped out of the building, the rain had stopped. The clouds were thinning, light cutting through for the first time in days. Elena looked back at the Lucent Core logo gleaming on the glass facade. Do you think it can ever be clean again? Damien followed her gaze. Not as it is, but maybe we can rebuild it into something better. She nodded, her eyes glinting with quiet resolve. Then let's start there. The city stretched before them, broken, complicated, alive. And for the first time in years, both of them felt something neither had dared to hope for. Forward motion. The storm outside had passed, but inside Damien's penthouse, tension buzzed like static in the air. The walls, once sterile and silent, were now lined with files, reports, and digital screens tracking Lucent Core's unraveling. Jonas stood near the window, reading through a folder while Elena sat at the table, staring at her coffee. Damien paced, his jaw tight, his voice steady but strained. Kalen's lawyers are playing the long game, Jonas said. They're pushing for arbitration. If the board agrees, this could disappear under corporate confidentiality. Of course they are, Damien muttered. They'll bury it like they buried everything else. Elena looked up. Can't we go public? If people knew what they did. Damien stopped pacing, his expression darkening. If we go public without airtight proof, it turns into noise. A scandal for a week, then forgotten. I won't give Kalen the satisfaction of surviving another cover-up. Jonas closed the file. You're assuming we still have time. He's got offshore accounts, political connections, and the best damage control team money can buy. If we don't move soon, he'll vanish. Damien leaned on the table, exhaling slowly. Then we make sure he can't. Elena frowned. What do you mean? He met her eyes. We leak it, but not to the press, to the victims. That evening, Damien and Elena sat side by side in his office, scrolling through archived patient records Jonas had decrypted. Each line told a story: device failure, cardiac arrest, internal bleeding, silence. Elena's voice trembled as she read the names. These families, most of them never even knew it was the equipment. They do now, Damien said, attaching a compiled dossier to an encrypted email. They deserve the truth before the headlines twist it. When he hit send, the message went out to over 200 families, each with evidence of Lucent Core's negligence. Dates, device IDs, payment trails. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena whispered, You just declared war. Damien nodded. Good. By dawn, the storm had shifted online. Forums and social media lit up with posts from grieving families, photos of lost loved ones, side by side with documents bearing Lucent Core's logo. The story spread faster than any press release ever could. Lucent Core lies trended within hours. News outlets scrambled to verify the leaks. And at the center of it all, Andrew Kalin's name appeared again and again, stamped on every fraudulent authorization. Jonas called just before noon. "You've started a fire we can't put out. Congratulations." Damien's tone was calm. "Then let it burn." But as he hung up, he caught Elena watching him, her expression a mix of admiration and fear. "Doesn't this put you at risk too?" she asked quietly. "I already was," he said. "Now it's just public." She hesitated. "And Sophie? If they come after me—" "They won't," Damien said, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." The conviction in his tone made her chest tighten. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't have to carry everyone's burden. But she also knew it was useless. The man standing before her wasn't the billionaire the world once saw. He was something rarer, a man who'd stopped running from his conscience. Later that night, Elena returned home to find an unmarked envelope slid under her door. Inside was a single page. "Ms. Ruiz, we know what you did. You and Ward have made powerful enemies. Step back before someone gets hurt. A friend." Her pulse quickened. She locked every door, double-checked the windows, and clutched Sophie's hand tighter than usual as she tucked her in. When Damien came by an hour later, she showed him the note. He read it silently, then folded it neatly. "Kalen's scared," he said. "That's good." "This isn't good," she snapped. "He knows where I live, Damien. My daughter sleeps in that room." His voice softened immediately. "You're right. You shouldn't be here." She stared at him. "You mean run?" "I mean move, somewhere safe, just for a while." Elena crossed her arms. "You think I'm hiding while you face this alone?" He smiled faintly. "I think you're a mother, and mothers don't get to gamble with fear." Her defiance faltered, replaced by exhaustion. "And what about you?" "I've been running my whole life," and he said quietly. "It's time I stop." 2 days later, chaos erupted. Lucent Core's stock plummeted. The board issued a public statement distancing themselves from Kalen, but it was too late. A whistleblower from the finance department had come forward with recordings. Kalen's voice, cold and unmistakable, ordering falsified safety certifications. The news hit like an earthquake. Elena watched it unfold on television, her hands trembling as the reporter said, "Former Lucent Core CFO Andrew Kalen is now under federal investigation following a leak of documents and audio evidence implicating him in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that led to multiple patient deaths." Sophie tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy, that's the bad man, right?" Elena nodded slowly. "Yes, baby, that's the bad man." Then she smiled faintly. "And he's finally getting what he deserves." That night, Damien stood alone in the rain outside Lucent Core headquarters, watching as reporters crowded the steps. Cameras flashed, microphones shouted his name, but he said nothing. For years, he'd built walls between himself and the world. Walls made of glass, money, and silence. Now those walls had shattered, and he stood in the rubble, unguarded. Elena's words from earlier echoed in his mind. You don't have to carry it all. Maybe he didn't, but he'd carry this, the truth, because no one else ever would. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm, not as a billionaire or a savior, but as a man finally at peace with the cost of redemption. The following morning, the city woke to a storm of headlines. Lucent Core whistleblower case explodes into federal investigation. Former CEO Damien Ward linked to internal cover-up, then redeems himself by leading exposure. Every channel, every feed, every whisper on the street revolved around the same names: Ward, Kalen, Ruiz. Elena sat on the couch, watching the coverage with Sophie nestled beside her. She felt like she was watching someone else's life unravel on the screen. "Mommy, they're saying your name," Sophie murmured, pointing at the ticker crawling across the bottom. Elena exhaled shakily. "I know, sweetheart." The reporter's voice was calm, polished, detached. Sources confirm that Nurse Elena Ruiz provided the documentation that broke the Lucent Core scandal wide open. Ruiz was terminated from her position 3 years ago after raising safety concerns, concerns which have now proven to be true. Sophie beamed proudly. You're famous. Elena smiled faintly but felt the weight of it all pressing on her chest. Fame wasn't what this was. This was exposure, and exposure always came with a cost. At that same moment, Damien sat across from federal agents in a conference room that smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee. His lawyer had warned him not to volunteer anything, but Damien ignored most of the advice. He'd been waiting for this. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Ward, said Agent Monroe, her tone measured. You understand this investigation may extend to your tenure as CEO. I understand, Damien replied evenly, and I'm prepared to hand over everything. Emails, transaction records, even private correspondence. I've already compiled the files. Monroe raised a brow. That's unusually proactive. Call it conscience, Damien said, leaning back. Or maybe I'm just tired of pretending not to know. The agent studied him. You're aware this could implicate you in negligence. Then I'll answer for it, he said. But make sure Kaylin answers too. There was a pause, then Monroe nodded slowly. He will. That evening the rain returned, softer now, washing the city clean. Damien drove through the empty streets until he reached the quiet neighborhood where Elena lived. Her apartment building looked small and worn, but there was a light in the window. He hesitated before knocking. Elena opened the door, visibly exhausted but calm. I saw the press conference, she said. You looked like you hadn't slept in a week. I haven't, he admitted. May I come in? She stepped aside and he entered, taking in the faint scent of chamomile and old paper. Sophie was asleep on the couch, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. Elena gestured toward her daughter. She's been asking when you'll visit. Damien smiled faintly. I was hoping soon. They sat in silence for a moment. The sound of rain filled the space between them. She's proud of you, you know, Damien said quietly. Elena glanced at Sophie, her expression soft. She doesn't understand what any of this means. I don't think she should. He nodded. You're probably right. After a long pause, Elena turned to him. What happens now? Now? Damien rubbed his jaw, weary. The company will crumble. The board will be dissolved. Kaylin's under arrest, and the feds are tearing through every document he ever touched. And you, she asked. I'll testify. Then I'll step back for good this time. She frowned. You're walking away again? This time it's not running, he said. It's rebuilding. The next day, Elena received an unexpected email, an invitation to speak at a congressional hearing on corporate accountability. Damien had already confirmed he would appear as well. Her first instinct was to decline. The idea of sitting under fluorescent lights, questioned by strangers in suits, made her stomach twist. But when she looked at Sophie's sleeping face that night, she whispered to herself, I have to finish what I started. The hearing was held a week later. Cameras lined the walls, reporters jostling for angles, flashes snapping like lightning. Damien and Elena sat side by side at the long oak table, their microphones gleaming under the lights. Ms. Ruiz, one congressman said, his tone both curious and respectful, when you were fired, did you ever imagine you'd end up here? Elena's throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. No, I thought the truth didn't matter. I was wrong. And what made you come forward again after all this time? She glanced at Damien. Because someone reminded me that silence helps no one, not even the innocent. The congressman nodded. And Mr. Ward, why risk your reputation for a company you no longer run? Damien met the man's gaze. Because I built that company on a promise to save lives. And somewhere along the way, I let greed bury that promise. This isn't redemption, it's debt. The room fell silent. The congressman scribbled something, then said softly, Thank you both. Outside, after the hearing ended, reporters swarmed them, questions flying like arrows. Damien placed a hand gently on Elena's back, steering her toward the waiting SUV. Inside the car, she exhaled shakily. That's it then. For now, he said. Justice takes time. She smiled faintly. You really believe that? He turned to her, his voice quiet but certain. I have to. That night, as they drove Sophie home from her grandmother's, the little girl looked up from her drawing in the back seat. Mommy? Yes, honey? Did we fix it? Elena hesitated. Not yet, but we're trying. Sophie grinned. Then we'll keep trying. Damien caught Elena's eyes in the rearview mirror. Her smile met his. Small, weary, but real. Outside, the city lights flickered past, glowing like distant stars. Somewhere behind them, a broken empire was collapsing. But ahead, just faintly, the road looked clear. 3 weeks after the congressional hearing, the city seemed to exhale at last. The frenzy had quieted, the headlines moved on, and the cameras that once camped outside Elena's building were gone. But the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Lucent Core's headquarters now stood half empty. The company's logo had been stripped from the marble lobby, leaving behind the faint outline of letters that once symbolized power. Investors fled, lawsuits piled high, and in a courtroom downtown, Andrew Kalin sat behind a defense table, flanked by lawyers whose suits couldn't hide their desperation. Damien watched from the back row as prosecutors laid out the evidence. Elena's documents, Jonas's digital audits, the whistleblower testimonies. Every piece built a tower of proof until Kalin's empire collapsed beneath it. When the verdict finally came, it landed like a gavel through glass. Guilty on all counts. There was no applause, no cheering, only silence. Justice, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. Kalin turned once before they led him away. His eyes found Damien's in the gallery, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. Not hatred, not regret, but recognition. Two men who had built the same machine, and only one had chosen to dismantle it. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and clear. Reporters swarmed the steps, but Damien ignored them. He spotted Elena waiting by the corner, Sophie holding her hand. "Did it really happen?" Elena asked as he approached. "It's over," Damien said. "He's going to prison." Elena exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. Sophie looked between them, her small voice bright and certain. "Then we won, right?" Damien smiled faintly. "We did." But deep down, he knew victory wasn't simple. There were families still grieving, hospitals still reeling, and a company still in ruins. Winning didn't mean healing. It just meant the truth had finally stopped running. That evening, Damien met Jonas at a quiet bar downtown. The TV above the counter replayed footage from the trial, the anchor summarizing the verdict, the headlines scrolling across the bottom. Former CFO sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Jonas sipped his drink, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," Damien said. Jonas glanced at him. "You could have taken the company back, you know. The board would have begged you to. Instead, you walked away." "I'm done building things that destroy people," Damien said quietly. "Lucent Core belongs to the people who fix it now, not me." Jonas studied him for a moment, then grinned. "You've changed." Damien smiled faintly. "That was the point." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The bartender changed the channel, the TV switching to a local news story, a new medical relief foundation launching in the city. Jonas raised an eyebrow. "That yours?" Damien shrugged. "Let's just say the funding came from somewhere anonymous." Jonas chuckled. "You're a terrible liar." Days turned to weeks. The headlines faded, but Elena and Damien's names lingered in quiet circles. The nurse who exposed the lie, the billionaire who helped her. Elena returned to work, though not in a hospital. She joined a nonprofit focused on patient advocacy, helping victims of medical negligence find their voice. The first time she stepped onto a stage to speak, she trembled, until she saw Sophie in the front row, waving proudly, and Damien standing discreetly in the back, watching with a small approving nod. Afterward, as the crowd filtered out, he approached her. "You were remarkable," he said. She laughed softly. "I was terrified." "That's what makes it honest," he replied. "People need to hear the truth from someone who's lived it." She looked at him, her eyes warm but questioning. "And what about you? What's next?" He hesitated. "I'm leaving the city for a while. There's too much noise here. I need quiet." Her smile faltered. "You're disappearing again." "Not disappearing," he said gently. "Just breathing." She nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. And when you've had enough quiet, he smiled faintly, then I'll find my way back. A week later, Elena found an envelope in her mailbox. No name, no return address, just a folded note and a check made out to the Connor Foundation for Patient Safety. For every life we couldn't save, let's make sure there's one we can. D.W. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She held the letter to her chest, whispering, "Thank you." Months passed. The city moved on. The scandal became another case study, another warning in law schools and boardrooms. But for those who had lived it, it was more than history. It was proof that even in a world built on profit and silence, conscience could still make a sound. On a warm afternoon, Elena took Sophie to the park. The trees were full and green, the air buzzing with laughter. Sophie raced ahead, chasing her kite across the grass. As Elena watched her daughter run, she felt something she hadn't in years. Peace, the kind that didn't come from victory, but from survival. Her phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen. From Damian Ward. Subject, just checking in. The mountains are quiet. The stars are brighter than I remembered. Hope you and Sophie are well. Tell her I still owe her pancakes. Elena smiled. She typed back, "We're good. Come home when you're ready. We'll keep the syrup warm." That night, Damian stood alone on a balcony overlooking a valley of stars. The wind moved softly through the pines, and for the first time in years, the world didn't feel heavy. He thought of Elena, of Sophie, of the boy named Connor, whose loss had started everything. And then, for the first time since that fateful phone call, he whispered to himself, it wasn't the wrong number after all. The spring sun had returned to the city, spilling warmth across streets that had forgotten it for far too long. Months had passed since the trial, long enough for wounds to begin knitting, though scars still marked the edges of everyone's lives. At St. Marine Community Center, laughter and quiet chatter filled the air. Tables were arranged in neat rows, banners of pale blue and white fluttering overhead. The Connor Foundation, inaugural health safety conference. Elena stood near the podium, watching as volunteers set up displays, new monitoring devices, educational charts, flyers bearing her logo. Not the sleek brand of a billion-dollar empire, but something humbler, something human. Sophie darted between tables with a clipboard nearly as big as she was, taking her role as assistant coordinator far too seriously. "Mommy," she called, "you forgot to sign the thank you cards." Elena laughed softly. "I'll get to them, promise." Behind her, a familiar voice said, "You always were terrible at delegating." She turned, and there he was. Damian Ward, dressed simply, no entourage, no shadow of the old corporate titan. He looked sunburned, peaceful, and, for the first time, free. "You came," she said, surprise and warmth threading through her voice. "I told you I'd make it," he replied. "I'm not late, am I?" "Right on time," Sophie squealed when she saw him. "Mr. Damian." She ran up and hugged him around the waist. "You missed pancake day." He crouched to her level. "Then I guess I'll have to make up for it. 2 stacks?" "3," she giggled and scampered off again. They walked together through the exhibition hall, where doctors, nurses, and researchers mingled. At every booth, Damian could see Elena's touch, small details that prioritize care over profit. It was the opposite of what Lucent Core had become. "This is incredible," he said, gesturing around them. "You did all this?" "We did," Elena corrected. "The families, the survivors, the ones who refused to stay silent. I just gave them a place to gather." He nodded. "You turned a tragedy into something that saves lives. That's more than most people ever do." She gave a small, thoughtful smile. "And you turned guilt into action. That's more than most people ever try." For a long moment they stood in silence, the hum of conversation flowing around them like water. Later, as speeches began, Elena took the stage. She spoke not as a victim or whistleblower, but as a builder of trust, of systems, of futures. Her voice was steady, carrying through the hall with a quiet power. "We're here because we learned the hard way what happens when profit outweighs people. But this foundation isn't about blame. It's about balance. Every device here, every test, every line of code represents one more safeguard between human life and human error. That's how we honor the ones we lost. That's how we begin again. Applause rippled through the room. When she stepped down, Damien was waiting at the edge of the stage, clapping slower than the rest, eyes shining with quiet pride. "You've got a talent for this," he said. She rolled her eyes. "You sound surprised." "Not at all," he said. "Just grateful I got to see it." Outside, the day had deepened into golden dusk. The conference ended, the banners fluttered in the breeze, and volunteers began packing up. Sophie chased Bubbles across the lawn, her laughter echoing like bells. Damien stood beside Elena, both of them watching her play. "So," Elena said softly, "where will you go now? Back to the mountains?" He shook his head. "No, maybe stay a while. I've been offered a consulting role for medical ethics reform. Thought I'd stick around, make sure they don't turn it into another PR stunt." She smiled. "Old habits die hard." He chuckled. "You're not wrong." They stood quietly for a moment, the orange light glinting off the windows of the community center. "You know," he said after a while, "that wrong number, it's saved more than one life." Elena turned to him, eyes soft. "I know." He looked down at her, a hint of mischief returning to his expression. "You think Sophie would mind sharing her pancakes tomorrow?" "She might," Elena teased, "unless you bring extra syrup." He laughed, the sound easy, unguarded. "Deal." As night settled over the city, Damien walked back to his car but paused halfway down the sidewalk. He looked over his shoulder at the glowing windows of the Foundation Center, the laughter, the light, the proof that broken things could be rebuilt. For years, he'd chased power, wealth, redemption. But what he'd found instead was something simpler, something that didn't need a price tag or a headline: belonging. He glanced once more at the building, where Elena was locking up, Sophie waving from the door. He raised a hand in return, a quiet promise in the gesture. Then he turned toward the horizon, the city lights stretching out before him like stars fallen to earth. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something to conquer. It felt like something to keep. And as he walked into the night, the echoes of a small girl's voice, panicked, trembling, full of faith, came back to him. "Please, my mommy won't wake up." He smiled to himself. That wrong number had started everything, and somehow, impossibly, it had dialed him back to life.